Welcome to Between Two Chairs, Demystifying Commercial Real Estate, the podcast that brings you the latest insights and trends on the South Florida commercial real estate market, with your hosts, Fernando Arencibia Jr. and Jennifer Woolman. In each episode, we dive into the world of commercial real estate and break down complex concepts to make them accessible for everyone. Whether you're a real estate professional, a curious investor, or just interested in the South Florida market in general, Between Two Chairs is the podcast for you. So pull up a chair and join us.
Welcome, everybody, to another episode of Between Two Chairs. My name is Fernando Arencibia, and with me, as always, is
Fernando what?
Arencibia, Arencibia.
Arencibia.
All right, Arencibia.
Sorry, I just had
That's
to
why
do
they used
that.
to call me Mr. A.
There you go.
And as you could tell by her voice, with me, as always, is the ever-controlling Jennifer Woolman. Hi,
Caffeinated.
Jennifer.
I'm caffeinated.
That's what it is?
Yes.
There you
Jess
go.
brought me a cortadito.
I love it.
I'm ready to go.
Once you give her a little coffee, she becomes a very strict director. So just keep that in mind. But I love it. So, Jennifer, what are we going to be discussing today? Because I like this topic, and there is a reason why I mentioned the word controlling, right?
So today we're talking about controlling the deal and the importance of controlling the deal. And I thought about it because I've had conversations with some of our agents recently, and both of them lost control of the deal. Mm-hmm. And that's when they called me going, help. You know, we have to emphasize how important it is to be in control of the deal. And there are a couple ways to do that, and we'll get into that in a minute, but it's basically identify all of the players, especially the final decision maker, set expectations, and remember time kills deals. We have one agent, and she's not one of the ones in the stories, but she's like, oh my gosh, this negotiation for a lease is taking so long that my tenant is having second thoughts. Mind you, this is a landlord whose space has been available for 15 months. It is not a pretty retail space. It is an elbow space. It is tucked in the way back of the center. It has no windows. This is their dream tenant, but the longer it takes them to get the deal done, the more the tenant is questioning the location, whether she wants to do it. We're getting into summer, which down here in Miami, anyone who's spent, June, July, August, September in Miami knows it's hot. So most people flee Miami in the summer. So time kills deals. Just remember that. So just to get started, in one of the cases, everything was going along smoothly. They had negotiated a purchase price. The buyer had already sent in the term sheet. Everything was good until 15 days before the closing. The mortgage broker calls and says, we need to get a new lender. And they convince the buyer to find a new lender. Mind you, they've already gone through inspections. The due diligence period is over. Financing contingency's over. Second deposit's been paid. And they say, sure, we'll change lenders. Needless to say, it's been 2.5 months. Several extensions later, all sorts of issues have come up since then, not necessarily related to the loan, but to the property itself. Now, the agent, the buyer, the seller, and the lender are all in this horrible situation. So as soon as the buyer and the buyer's agent let the mortgage broker decide it was time to change financing without exploring all of the ramifications, since the commitments had already been passed and everything else, they lost control of the deal. Now the person in control of the deal 100% is the lender. Right. And some might argue, well, the lender is always the one in control of the deal, because at the end of the day, if they don't finance it, it doesn't go through. However, who you choose to work with and who your buyer chooses to work with is so, so important, because it turns out that this is somebody that the agent and the buyer have had a problem with before. but because of personal relationships, they gave them the benefit of the doubt. To me, this isn't baseball. This isn't 3 strikes, you're out. If you're a vendor and I use you on a deal and you do me wrong once, you're done. Because the buyer's money is on the line, right? Correct. And it's not something that I can control. If I'm giving you the benefit of the doubt and you're supposed to be providing a service and you say you can do it, and at the last minute you back out and cause my client, it comes back to me. Yeah. So that was one situation.
Yeah, and unfortunately, sometimes we've had those scenarios where the vendor that you're dealing with is approaching it with a, almost like wishing it to be so. Hopefully everything works out. Right. Instead of, just addressing and tackling the issues head on, being precise, being efficient, and being consistent with the communication so that all the parties are informed and everybody makes their best decision. Because, it's to your point, it could be an incredibly significant detriment to the buyer.
Yeah.
And it might be all of their life savings might be on the line,
For sure. And in this situation, in terms of time kills deals, it was a long closing on purpose for all sorts of reasons, because of the buyer, because of the lender, because of property conditions. So it was a delayed closing. So my guess is that the lender's like, this isn't going to close for 90 days. And probably waited, even though the appraisal, everything was done ahead of time so that they wouldn't have the issues. So the buyer and the buyer's agent did a lot of great things ahead of time. They did the appraisal during the due diligence period. They found out items that had been misrepresented because the owner didn't know a lot about the property. It wasn't connected to municipal water as it said it was. It was all these weird things, but they did their job, and they did a good job, and they identified anything. So my guess is the lender's just like, 90 days, I've got plenty of time.
Correct.
And then waited till the last minute, and oops, it kind of slipped by.
That also brings up a good point, which is sometimes when you're negotiating these contracts, what seems to be a positive, which is, we have plenty of time, sometimes that could be a detriment. Sense of urgency is important on all parties, including lenders. Right? They don't like to make decisions and then having to wait after the decision has been made to close, because to your point, so many things can happen in that in-between range. And it's the same thing with a recent transaction that I had where everything was ready, the lender was ready, but we were waiting to close out a 40-year recertification of a warehouse. And, unfortunately, so many of factors are out of your control when you're dealing with a municipality and when you're dealing with a closing. In this case, we were dealing with multiple parties, a tenant that hadn't left yet, having access to the property, pulling permits, dealing with, all of those processes that are in place in which, the city doesn't have a sense of urgency to close things out, and you're having to deal with an engineer. So there are so many third parties that are involved in a transaction like that, when you end up counting it all together. So think about it. We have the 2 brokers, you have the buyer and the seller. Those are usually what is there. Now you're dealing with the 2 attorneys, right? Because of the way that the transaction was put together. You're dealing with an engineer that is a third party that comes out and does the inspection. You're dealing with the general contractor and the subcontractor for the electrical. You're dealing with the permitting process with the city. You're dealing with an inspector of the permitting process. Now you have to re-engage the engineer to come back and finalize the 40. Now you have to submit it to the city to another party that is in the 40-year recertification that has nothing to do with the person who did the inspection on behalf of the city for the electrical. So there are so many parties that are involved there that that things can, and the tenant, right? That's right, the tenant. So there's so many parties that are involved in that scenario where it's very difficult to put a very specific timeline as to when everything's going to get done. As often happens, that timeline, the more that it gets extended, the more there is an opportunity for people to want to retrade and change the terms of the deal, or to really get out of the deal because, so many things happen. And in this case, I will just say this. Nobody was expecting all the tariffs to come in at the same time. Nobody was expecting for the buyer to now have to deal with a precipitous increase in the cost of goods for their business and how they evaluated it now.
Financing, too.
The financing, right? You have a lender who's like, look, if you don't finish it by this time, then we got to do this, we got to do that. So all of those things are important components of that, and that's what kills deals.
So how did you control that deal? Because I remember there were a lot of times where the buyer I thought was going to walk. I'm like, if I were the buyer, I'd walk.
Yeah, no, listen.
And you did a great job controlling that.
The only thing to do there is, number one, you don't hide the sun with your thumb, right? You bring everything out to the light. You have to have a sense of urgency on the things that you can control. And you have to speak to the other parties that also have a sense of urgency in order to get their deal done. And you're trying to facilitate other people to do their jobs. So if there was a way for me to facilitate the general contractor, then that's what we did. If there was a way to facilitate the subcontractor, if there was a way to facilitate the work of the engineer to come and do the inspections, he wanted to, the only time that he had available was 6 p.m. on a Friday. We're there at 5:30 p.m. making sure everything is ready for him to go and do his inspections. And if he needed for us to be outside of his office in order to get the report, then that's exactly what was done. And so the only thing you could do there is help other people facilitate their work because they're out of your control, and it's the only thing you could control. Communicate very, very clearly so that there is no, there's full transparency that everybody's trying to do the right thing, and then everybody has to make decisions. Brings me to a point that I often repeat when we are, training our agents. And this is something that I learned a long time ago, which is that when you're a broker, just think of the word broker. You're just brokering the transaction. You are the buffer. You're there to facilitate the consummation of this transaction between two parties. The way I look at it is you control the process. They control the decision. So I would never tell my client what to do with their money, right? I always like to keep it in my mind in absolute clarity that, I'm not here to tell my client what to do with their money. And I respect the fact that, when a seller has a high expectation of value, even when the market doesn't want to give it to them, in my mind, it's never about you should do this because you're making, I'm always very respectful of the fact that ultimately you got to make the decision. My job as a broker is to give you as much information as possible so you can make the best decision and to bring you as many options as possible, right? Ideally, our job is to bring multiple offers scenario so that the client has the ability to then make what is going to be their best decision moving forward. But I have to control the process. If I'm sitting down with a client and the client wants to tell me how the property is being marketed, where he wants to direct how he wants the signage to be, all those things, then the question that arises in me is, what kind of value do I bring to the table for you? Because if I'm not adding value to you, then this relationship is not going to work. Why hire me if you're not going to let me do my job? Now, that's not to say that this is not a collaborative process. It is a collaborative process. I do want input. I do want feedback from the person that is hiring me. However, I have to bring something to the table, right? And it is my expertise is the reason why you're hiring me, right? So that's what I mean by controlling the process, right? I have to make those decisions because of the work that I have put in to understand the market, the work that I have put in to understand the marketing, to understand what is really my audience for the kind of buyer or the kind of tenant for the property. Those are going to be important components that are there. But ultimately, the decision is left to the owners. I'm just trying to set the table in a way where the owner has as many options as possible. And I say the owner, but it could be a tenant, it could be, a buyer. But it's just basically so that the end user or the investor has all of the options available to the table and they have the best information so they can make the best decision, for themselves.
So in addition, we always talk about, in addition to the information and the value that you provide, we always talk about the importance at the very, very beginning of setting expectations, right?
Absolutely.
And so in the second case, this was an agent whose longtime client calls him and says, hey, I saw this property. I went out, I called the broker, I toured it with the broker. I love the property. I want you to make an offer. And so the agent, she wanted to know, how do I go about sticking my nose in now that, right, they've already gone, they've had a conversation. I wasn't privy to that. I haven't seen the property, etc. So I said, first of all, the first thing is to call the listing broker. Call the listing broker and say, hey, I'm so sorry. I understand, so-and-so went to see the property. They now want to make an offer. I understand I'm in a strange position. Are you okay? And he said, the listing broker said, no problem. So they went ahead, instead of right then and there the buyer's agent having a conversation with the buyer and saying, hey, look, I understand you did this. Luckily, I knew the broker. I was able to get in. From now on, please make sure, that everything goes through me. You and I have to strategize because the listing broker, even though they're a transaction broker, they're hired by the seller. So didn't have that conversation. She didn't have that conversation with her client. And sure enough, they present an offer. They said, what do you want, LOI or contract? They said, no, submit an LOI first. They submit an LOI. They counter the LOI. And then the buyer calls the selling broker again. Directly.
To negotiate the LOI. Right.
And not only did they negotiate the LOI, they negotiated all sorts of different things. And so then I get a call from our agent, and she's frustrated. She's like, I don't know what to do. And I said, first of all, have you ever had a conversation with your buyer as to how this works, as to what your expectations are of the buyer, about your relationship with the buyer? And she says, no, this is just a buyer she's bought tons of stuff from me before. It's not an issue. And I said, well, it is an issue. They don't know how the whole system works.
Right.
And so they're complicating. So you need to take control.
Is it a thing where now she's dealt with them before? Yeah. Was it a different kind of property? Was it that now it was commercial versus residential?
It was everything. They've done commercial leases before. Oh. They've done residential purchases before. Oh. They've done commercial, Yeah. It's a long-standing client, not a friend of the family, but somebody who kind of came in. It was a referral that they got along really well. They had a good working relationship. But from day one, all the years, I think they've been, I think she said over 10 years. I said, and you never had with her, you never had the conversation with the buyer as to how the whole process, never. I said, okay, shame on you. You always need to set expectations. So I think you need to sit down and say, look, going forward, we really need to do this. Here's why. Right. And kind of backtrack. So anyway, everything worked out fine. But, at the same time, the agent called and she was really upset with the listing broker. She was really upset. And I said, wait a minute. I said, this is really on you.
Right.
And I said, so don't be upset. The selling agent the listing agent is still working with you. Your buyer's still working with you. So it's obvious that the buyer trusts you. So just go ahead and have that, to your point, be transparent, have that conversation, say the kind of issues that can come up. I would have a conversation with the listing agent as well and say, hey, my bad. I should have had a conversation with my buyer, but from now on, if my buyer calls you, please redirect them back to me, right? Exactly. So
it's really interesting because, it just so happens that we had a conversation about this with our agents today, which is how important that initial conversation with the buyer or the seller are to, number one, really gauging what is their need, right? Mm-hmm. What is their sense of urgency, and how do you add value to help them accomplish that goal? And how important it is to not circumvent that conversation. Mm-hmm. What is your expectation? All those things. Those are very important, and I remember I had a client who had like a love-hate relationship with brokers, right? Because, he had negative experiences, and he hired me to sell a property in a market that I knew very well in Little Havana. And I remember we sold it on the last day of the listing. He was not a person that was he was, by the way, great person to deal with, and, did everything in his power to make the deal work, for sure. But not a person that was very free with the compliments. And I remember him giving me a great compliment at the end. It's like, and a great compliment by him was like, this would have been even more painful if you had not gotten involved, that kind of a thing, But I remember years later, he again called me because he listed a property on his own. And, he asked me for my opinion. Like, he says, I'm not getting any bites. I went through this process. I paid this one-time fee and, I listed it, but I'm not getting any bites. And so I reviewed it and I basically told him, look, This is what I think is wrong with the listing. I wasn't trying to get I just really felt like I'm just going to honestly tell you what I would do. And then you make the decision as to doing it, And I remember there were things, like I said, like your property description is too technical. You're dying in the weeds. You don't have really an audience that you're attracting. Nobody cares that they're single hung windows and that they are rated whatever XYZ, and putting a lot of technical stuff that is important to you, but that is not really going to get people's eyeballs. I gave them all stuff, and then within 10 minutes of telling him everything that I would do, and I would say, look, spend some money on professional pictures, do this, do that. And he goes like, and I just happened to be out of town. And he goes like, when are you back in town? And I goes like, I'm back in town in 2 days. He goes, would you like to list the property? And I said, I would love to list the property. And so, and for him, he was very clear, and I was very clear, that there was very little that I could teach him, right? But on the things that I could teach him, he saw value. But more importantly, he always understood that there was value. Like in the example that you mentioned, some people feel, well, if I speak to the listing agent directly, I'm going to get a better deal. My client understood what we always know, which is it's good to have a buffer. Mm-hmm. Because when you're buffering, the person that you're dealing with doesn't 100% know what your client is thinking. You could stand on the ground of this is as far as it's going to go, but they don't really fully know what your client is thinking. There is value in that negotiating part. And I tell people, even when I bought my own house, I used an agent because you need that buffer. There is value in that buffer. There is leverage there, and you could get more out of it than what you think you're saving. So again, it's to that value. But yeah, I know that the title of this is Controlling the Deal, but I want to make it clear here. It's controlling the deal. It's not manipulating the deal.
Right.
There's a big difference.
Huge difference.
There's a big difference. What we're talking about is basically controlling the things that you can control so that you can add value to the client. If, like I said before, if you have a client where you haven't earned that trust or that level of comfort, or they're trying to just hire you as if you were an employee and they just want you to do what you told them, what they're telling you to do. No, I want the signage to be like this, or I want that, and whatever. Then you're at the beginning of that conversation, you should know this is not the client for me. Right? I'm not adding value. You're not seeing value in my services. And this is going to be a nightmare.
Right. They're going to micromanage. They're going to know everything better than you do. And in that case, great. All the power to you. I'll be happy to help list it yourself.
No, and the other part of it is that I can have a conversation with a client who has a very clear perspective of the value of their property. You remember we had an agent that was talking to someone that wanted to sell their business, but they didn't want to share the P&Ls. Well, look, it doesn't matter how much I like you. It doesn't matter how much I believe you. It doesn't matter how much I like your business and how I believe your business is worth it. When I go to the marketplace and I tell them, oh, we don't have any financials, the market is going to be like, okay, I'll give you the asset value of the things that are inside of that business. I'm not going to, what am I paying for? I don't know what I'm paying for. So at that point, if your client doesn't even want to disclose that to you, then you really, as far as I'm concerned, you don't have a client.
Right.
You have someone who's just they're tire kicking. They're trying to test the waters, and they want to use you to do that. And so a big part of controlling the deal, to your point, is you got to set expectations from the very beginning, and you got to know when to walk away.
Right. And sometimes walking away is at the beginning. Yeah. And I think you
Or sometimes people come back to you,
right,
because they realize that, well, you're basically laying a line on the line. You're saying, look, I want to help you, but I would be doing you a disservice if I were telling you that you could just dictate, this is what my business is worth. Let's go to the market and then we'll figure it out later. And I'll talk to people, and once I talk to them, they're not going to need my financials. I mean, that doesn't make sense.
It's not realistic. And that's why I think it's so important you made the comment, control the process, not the decision. Correct. And that's why it is so important to know who the final decision maker is. Oh, yeah. There are a lot of properties, and especially commercial properties, that are owned by companies that have property management firms involved, or they're companies that are made up of several siblings, and there might be one sibling who owns more than the others, but the other ones are doing all the preliminary work, so if you're working with the minority shareholders to come up with everything and all of the ideas, and they agree, and they either don't don't present it in the right way to the majority shareholder, or they get it, do a workaround or whatever it is, all of a sudden you're going to get a deal done and the majority shareholder is like, well, no.
Yeah, exactly. Can I share a quick story about that you just reminded me? So I'm selling this property that is owned by 6 siblings. The 6 siblings live all over the state of Florida. And there's a very clear divide. There are 3 siblings that are very wealthy, and then there are 3 siblings that are not as wealthy. And now they're ready to sell it. And one of the 3 that is not as wealthy was the one that would manage the property and did all the work for the property. And to me, it kind of later on, what I realized is that it kind of felt like there were 2 camps and there was a representative for each camp. Now, my client was very clear in letting me know, yeah, I got 6 siblings. I'm the one who's running point. But ultimately, we all have to make the decision. And I respected that. I understood that. She was certainly, in all the legal documents, she was the one that was running point on everything. It came to a point where we received an offer, which was a very good offer that included some seller financing. And it was like a 50% loan to value. It was a great interest rate. It had a prepayment penalty. So my client was going to sell it for X amount. But at the end of that 5 years, she was going to make more money. And it was 100% of that interest was on a prepayment penalty. So my client, there was great value, but they didn't understand the whole concept of, they couldn't fully grasp the concept of the seller financing.
The other siblings.
I said, yeah, well, even this sibling was like, I'm having a hard time selling the concept because number one, we're not getting all the money up front, but number two, what happens if there's a default? And I said, well, most owners would celebrate a default because you have 50% of the money already on your side. So the likelihood of them defaulting, the cost to them defaulting is significant. At that time, we're talking about $1.8 million.
Yeah, and you still own the property.
And you still own the property. But they wanted to meet with the buyer, who was now going to basically be, they were lending money to that person. But it wasn't her that wanted to meet. It was one of the other parties. So we had to arrange for a meeting in, close to the property so that they could meet. We met over coffee and have a conversation and ask questions. And the buyers came ready. They came ready with letters of recommendation from their lenders, from 3 major banks in 3 community banks in South Florida. I say, you could go to any of these banks, you could have this conversation. We could get the loan from the bank, but we feel that it is more beneficial to get the loan directly from you. It's going to be less costly, and I'd rather pay you the interest than having to go through all of the regulatory stuff, especially since I'm putting 50% of the money, and I'm going to have to invest money in the property once I buy it. Look, it worked out. They got their money. And 5 years later, they got the lump sum, and in between they got paid, and and it was all happy. But to your point, that was kind of a curveball. Like, I knew the other members were going to be involved. I didn't know that when it got to that point that now I had to bring somebody in. But luckily, everybody's expectations were clear, and I make sure that everybody signed the listing agreement.
Right,
that
which is super important,
right? Because that way you don't have that issue like, oh, I never agreed to sell it,
right?
And because that's what would have caused more of an issue. And those are difficult conversations to have because you're there, you're ready to list it. It can potentially be an issue, but you know what? Let's address the issue before you actually invest time, energy, money, resources in order to do that. Let's make sure all the parties are in agreement and you don't have that hiccup, later on. Because, we've seen issues like that come up later on, right at the time of closing, especially during title work, which is, not the time to have those issues.
If you're listing a property and it's owned by a corporation, it's always good to go through, see, obviously check the articles of incorporation. You're going to have to ask for the information because even the person who might be there as the manager might say, oh, no, I'm the manager, I'm the person that's allowed to sign everything. But if you don't see those articles of incorporation or the operating agreement, you don't see that, you might not know that there is somebody in there who has a majority say. And yes, that might be the person managing the day-to-day, but at the end of the day, everybody's going to have to sign off on that sale.
You mentioned at the beginning when you were telling this thing that there were 3 things to focus on controlling the deal. Can you repeat those? Because I think
identify
those were really
all
good.
of the players.
Identify all the players.
Set expectations.
That's right.
And time kills deals.
And time kills deals. Yeah, no.
So it's always the urgency and timing to help you control the deal. And to your point, it's not manipulating, it's controlling the process. It's helping provide value to the decision makers, not making the decisions.
No, the other thing that I would say, because I think it's an example of some of the things that you've mentioned that, we've dealt with our agents, how important clear, precise, and consistent communication are to the deal. Nobody is expecting for any real estate transaction to be clean, meaning that there's not going to be any hiccups or delays or potential delays or any of those things. Those things happen. They don't always happen, but you don't necessarily have to go through extensions, right, to close. You could still close on time, but yet go through some hiccups, right? There's always some hair, that you have to clean out. There's always something in the deal that you have to figure out. Where I always found important is if you're dealing with another party and, for example, they have to deliver an escrow letter and, there's delays here, delays there. Those are things that you start to see red flags. And especially in a loan commitment or anything like that, or when the loan officer is not as communicative, is not as, upfront and transparent about it, those things become, in my view, they become problematic. And so when you're in the middle of a transaction, and especially at the beginning, and you start to see red flags, you don't want to ignore them. You want to kind of pick at them and figure out what's going on, because the earlier you figure it out, the better. And it's better to address it right away than to have to do emergency surgery on the deal on the back end.
Well, and I think that brings up another point under the set expectation side is when you're having a conversation with your buyer or seller, find out, do they already have an attorney or a closing company? Have they worked with them before? If it's a buyer, do they have a lender? Have they worked with that lender before? What kind of deals have they worked on with that lender? Because as we know, not all lenders lend or have the specialty of every single asset class or every single dollar amount. So that's part of setting expectations so that if somebody is going after a multifamily property, but their lender specializes in medical office, they might, that could be an issue. It might not be, but it could be. So that's a good conversation to have up front so that, again, the expectations can be met, and it goes to your clear communication as well. And always that's why Fernando and I are so adamant about making sure that you build up your toolkit of experts and several lenders, several community banks, several inspection companies, several zoning attorneys, because attorneys specialize in different things. I love it when I get calls from agents and they're like, hey, can I do this here? I'm like, I don't know. That's not my expertise, but I can give you the names of zoning attorneys or whatever, but I don't do that kind of transaction. So it's important to have all that information as well.
You also have to look at it as it's an awesome responsibility. And by awesome, I mean a great and big responsibility when you're dealing with people's money, right? And ultimately, when they're making these real estate decisions, it's important to be careful and to provide a higher level of care when it comes to the decisions that they're going to make, because they are of significant impact. And so as you go through your real estate career, you learn a lot from attorneys, you learn a lot from CPAs, you learn a lot from zoning attorneys, you do those things. You have an understanding of what is happening and what can potentially happen, but you never want to give the impression and you never want to give advice that could be, impactful to the decision that your client is going to make about things that you're not an expert in. Right. And you have to look at it not just because of the legalities of it, but more importantly about the right thing to do, which is
the morality of it.
The morality of it, right? Like, you're buying this with the intention that you want to create X. I don't know if you could create X. I believe you can from what I gathered and the information that I have, but you want something more substantial than my word. If I was in your shoes, I want to hear from a zoning attorney. I want to get that information straight from the zoning department. I want to pay the money to get a zoning verification letter. I want to have clarity that I am going to do this, and that if it's not done by right, that I have a pathway to be able to achieve it. Because ultimately, you're buying it for that purpose. And if you don't get that purpose, you're going to be a very unhappy person. And ultimately, it could be detrimental to your bottom line. So that level of care is important. That level of intentionality is important. It's not to circumvent the conversation when we say you have to check with an attorney. It's not to circumvent the conversation when we say you have to check with a CPA. It's just that imagine all of the tax laws that change year over year, how complex the tax code is, right? And a CPA can give you some ways to look at the problem or at the issue in a much better way than a broker can. Right? Just because we're not involving that on a day-to-day basis. Those things are important.
And to your point, Joanna Watkins with, head legal counsel for the Florida Association of Realtors, and you love to repeat this too, is always be the source of the source. Mm-hmm. So it's easy in some of these deals and negotiations, especially with some of the people you're dealing with, to maybe lose sight or not want to look bad. So you say yes, or you're like, yeah, that can be done, or I checked the zoning map and yeah, that can be done, but that's your ego getting in the way. It's okay for you to say you don't know. And you can say, based on the city of Miami zoning code, it says you can do this. Here is the link. Here's the name of some zoning attorneys. So don't ever be afraid of saying you don't know, because saying you don't know is probably going to keep you out of trouble and make you look better in the long run, as long as you can quote a source or provide them with the information. And you can always say, I don't know, but I'll find out. Let's set up a phone call with attorney.
Another way that I've done it, because, you develop a certain understanding of certain areas, especially if you focus on one area and it becomes your market, and you know the market very well and you know the zoning very well. And I've done this with people where I say, based on what I see in the zoning code and what other people have been able to build, I believe you could do this, but we're going to trust but verify, right? So we're going to make sure that when we negotiate this, that you have plenty of time in your feasibility of the land or your feasibility of the property during due diligence to get all that information, right? Because you don't want to make this decision based on what we see other people are able to build or what we believe the zoning to be. You want to make sure that you verify that you get all the information that you can. And it's the same thing when you're dealing with tenancies and when you're dealing with landlords. You might say, is that the same issue when you're looking at zoning for a certificate of use in a place? Well, it may be important for you to know that a municipality has a water moratorium. Right. So like, for example, in Hialeah, I remember a landlord who had a very difficult time being able to rent out a space to a barber shop because they could not put an additional sink in the shop, right? Because there was a water moratorium, because in this case, this was the city of Hialeah, and the city of Hialeah had to improve their infrastructure in order for them to lift the water moratorium. Same thing happened in Coconut Grove a few years back,
no development,
right? Yeah. No development. And so now you make those decisions. You say, yeah, the zoning says it's not a problem. The code says it's not a problem. But now you have other items that are happening within the municipality that are going to impact your ability to do it. So now, whereby I may be buying this because I want to do the project and I want to see a raise within the 3-year span. Now I might have to wait 5-6 years, like Crescent Height had to do in some of their projects. And, so their, Grosse Pointe development had to do with certain projects, Coconut Grove, if I remember correctly. Those things are impactful and they're significant. And so it goes beyond, one thing or the other. All right, my friend. I could be talking about this for hours,
we're done. We don't want to.
All right.
I'm going to control this episode.
There you go. I told you she was controlling. All right, guys. Thank you again for listening to us and checking us out. I really appreciate. We very much appreciate your patronage. I hope you're getting a lot out of it. For now, it is goodbye until the next time. 3:05 hour on a Thursday where we publish all of our. So bye, everybody. Say it again.
Say bye, Fernando.
Bye, Fernando.
Bye, Fernando.